Alright guys, welcome back to the shop. So we're going to be starting on a brand new project today, and that is a bed frame for a king size bed. So this is going to be a pretty interesting project because it's going to be big and fairly simple. So one of the things that I've found interesting about building a bed frame, I haven't actually built one myself, but I've watched lots of videos and now I have a pretty good understanding of how to approach this project. But one of the things that's interesting about it is overall a bed frame is an extremely simple thing to build. What makes it complicated is the just sheer weight and scale of all of the components involved. We have one component on here, our side stretchers, that in their finished form are going to be 12 inches wide and 81 inches long. So that is going to be a thick, heavy piece of wood, and all of this is going to be built from 8/4 stock, except for our floating panels, which are going to be made from some book-matched 4/4 stock. So it's going to be some really big, hefty pieces of furniture that we somehow have to manage through all the machinery in the shop here. And so the plans for the bedroom are actually really simple and kind of self-explanatory. It's only 3 pages. Compare that to something like the bedroom set that was like a 20-page book. This is going to be nice and easy because it's all about just processing the lumber and getting it together rather than doing all this like super complex stuff to it. So mainly if we start by just looking at the footboard right here, you can kind of see there that this is overall a very simple design. We're going to have 3 floating panels in the middle here and then just some side structure around that. It's going to be super easy to actually put all these components together. Again, the only real challenge here is just the sheer mass of things. And so if we move over to that lumber pile that I showed you guys in yesterday's video, we have a decent amount of 8/4 lumber here. We've got 2 pieces of white oak. One is 11 inches wide, one is about 10 inches wide. Those are going to be using for all of our floating panels. We're going to split them, book match them. That's going to be really cool. Plus the pieces of white oak that I chose, the excess on them is going to lead to some very cool projects once we're done with this bed here. Then below that, we have a whole bunch of walnut. We have about 6 pieces here, and then I've got an extra piece that's in my lumber stack that I'm going to be using for this project just to make up some of the stuff that I was missing. So we're going to be going through the lumber now, kind of figuring out what pieces we want to use for certain things. I do have 2 specific pieces of walnut that I'm using for these side stretchers, purely because I bought them because they were about 12, they're a little over 12 inches wide, so we can actually make those side stretchers out of one solid piece all the way along. So all of our walnut is rough sawn. So what this means is that this is exactly the state that it would have come off the sawmill in. So there are pros and cons to working with rough sawn wood, but for me, I find it actually works out a lot better in the long run. Because one of the biggest benefits of working with rough sawn wood is it's oversized. So normally when you buy 8/4 stock from a lot of the woodworking stores, and like this 8/4 white oak that I have in the back here, that stuff has all been surfaced so that you can actually see the grain in it. Whereas with the walnut, because this is still rough sawn, this is about 2 1/8 inch thick. So these are nice, hefty pieces. We have a lot of excess material to work with here, which is one of the biggest benefits of working with that rough sawn stock. But obviously, anytime you have a benefit, there is also going to be a downside. Because of that extra thickness, we don't get to see what we're actually buying. So especially with this rough sawn walnut, it is nearly impossible to tell what is hardwood and what is sapwood before you actually touch anything to it. Because there's areas of these where there's parts that are broken out and they look like it might be sapwood. But as soon as you take a hand plane to it and clear off that material, you find out it's completely heartwood. It's really challenging to figure out when you're getting, a really nice piece of heartwood and when you're getting, a really crappy piece of sapwood. And again, this has gone both ways for me. One time I managed to get a fully quarter sawn, an 8-foot long, but I think it was about 6 inches wide piece of quarter sawn walnut. All because it was rough sawn, nobody knew what it was, nobody knew how valuable that piece of wood was, so it just got thrown into the pile here and I was able to grab it, which was an awesome thing. But there's also times where I've bought an entire 8/4 board that is basically solid sapwood. Sometimes you get really good benefits, sometimes you get ripped off. It's one of those risks that you have to play and it's a little bit of a gamble. Okay, so having cleaned up the edges on these boards, it looks like we only have one that is going to be a little bit of a dud. Now I think that I can make this one work because it's got mainly heartwood right in the middle of the board. The board is about 10.5 inches wide, so it means we're only using about the middle 8 inches of that. So there is a little bit of material on either side that we can kind of go without. But like I said, this is always going to be the risk when you're working with rough sawn wood. You don't actually get to see the grain or what's heartwood and what's sapwood. And especially with walnut, these lumber companies are really bad about just trying to get rid of the sapwood. They all want to be able to sell the sapwood just as much as they sell the heartwood, even though nobody wants the sapwood. So they do basically whatever they can to hide that sapwood. That's why the company that I buy my lumber from, they only sell rough sawn walnut. All the other lumber that they sell conveniently is all it's all surfaced on at least 2 sides. so that you can actually see the grain in it. But the walnut, for obvious reasons, is sold in this rust-on state so that you can't see kind of what you're buying. Now that we have a rough idea of what our wood is going to look like, now we can actually start laying out our components and figuring out where things are going to go. Because that's one of the most important things when you're starting to break down stock. You want to have a good idea of what your wood is going to look like, where you want to lay pieces out, stuff, what kind of colors and that you're dealing with. And now you want to figure out how to best use that wood. So now that we have a rough idea of what areas of those boards are heartwood, what areas are sapwood, we can start laying out some of our components. So all of us are pretty familiar with what a bed frame is. It usually consists of a footboard and a headboard that are connected by some kind of side rails or structures. Now, I don't know if I mentioned this at the beginning, the bed frame that we're going to be building here is just literally a frame. We're not going to be building any of the cross pieces on the inside there, because the bed that I'm building this frame for is its kind of own standalone thing. It's one of those ones where the two sides can lift up and down independently. A really fancy thing. It's already got a whole platform in that. So all I'm doing here is just building a nice simple frame. So in this frame, there's actually quite a few areas where we can easily hide our really heavy sapwood pieces. So in the headboard especially, most of the headboard is never going to be seen. That whole back section, even the sides of it, are really never going to be seen. So as long as on the headboard we can make sure that we have heartwood on the front, our pieces in that lumber stack that have heavy sapwood, they're mostly sapwood going through them, we can use them for our tall vertical leg pieces there, or some of these dividers in the middle, or our back stretchers and that, all on that headboard, and we'll never ever see any of that sapwood. Now when it comes to the footboard, obviously it's going to be a little bit more visible. You're going to see both sides of this top rail. You're going to see all three sides of the vertical legs, but you're not going to be able to see most of the sides of these two vertical dividers in the middle and then that bottom stretcher. So again, there are plenty of areas in this bed frame where we can hide that sapwood. And so what we're going to do now is going to bring over a couple of those boards, lay them out on the workbench, the table saw that, and then just start figuring out how to lay out our components to get the best use out of the wood that we have. Alright, so I've got most of our boards up on the bench now, and I've cut off one end, the end that I think is going to be better to start with. As you guys can see, when I cut off those different ends, that reveals exactly how much heartwood and sapwood there is in that specific section. Of course, when we get up, 20 inches up the board here, everything could change, but at least we know that at this end, that is exactly what that board is going to look like. So this one that I have on top here, I'm going to use for my footboard leg stock, at least this bottom section of it, because I know that it has mainly heartwood to it. There's a little bit of sapwood in the corner here, but again, this board is a little over 9 inches wide. We only need two 4-inch wide pieces out of this, so we're going to end up with a 4-inch piece, a 4-inch piece, and then a little bit of extra material. So I know that my footboard legs need to be 32 inches long in their final length, so I'm going to go in here, measure up about 33 inches, and then make my little mark. And all you need to do with the green tape is just remind yourself what the heck that part is going to be. Because if you just end up with a whole bunch of different lines all over your boards, it gets very confusing very quickly. You're going to start messing things up. So all I'm going to do here is put in footboard legs, and now I know exactly, and times 2, just so I know that I'm getting 2 out of there. So now I know exactly when I make this cut and I have this piece left over, I know exactly what this piece of wood is going for. And so one thing I forgot to mention is that when you do your end cut, you want to cut at least a 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch into the wood. As you can see from these offcuts here, that's a pretty thick piece of material. It does suck to lose material, but what it's really important to check for here is improper drying and internal stress fractures. So luckily I do have one board that has some of those internal stress fractures to it, so I'll drop it on the bench here and I'll give you guys a look. So these are what are called internal stress fractures, and they come when the board is improperly dried. Now, anytime you're dealing with 8/4 stock or thicker, you're gonna have issues with improper drying methods. Because what a lot of these big lumber yards do is they want to save money, and drying time in a kiln is very expensive. So they generally set it to one temperature, put all their boards in, 16/4 all the way down to 4/4. They stuff them all in there and they pull out the different sections when they're dry. And so the trick here is that different thicknesses of wood need to dry at different temperatures in order to, protect the fibers in that. So as a woodworker, there's really nothing you can do about it because these cracks are not visible from the outside of the board. So this space right here was about 2 inches into the board. And so on the outside of the board, there was not a single crack showing. So I thought the board was really good. As soon as I cut into it, it revealed these internal stress fractures. Now, the nice thing about these internal stress fractures is that they're only usually near the ends of the boards. You're not usually going to find them, in the middle section of the board. So for this piece, I already cut down a pretty big section of it. I used that in the hanging wine cabinet. So basically all the wood from about 12 inches in from the end here, all the way to this other end that we have already cut off here, should be perfectly good wood, good for the project and all that. It's only this end area that we want to try and avoid using, and we're going to make sure we lay out our pieces to specifically avoid using this whole end area here. And so now it just becomes a giant puzzle of we need to take all the pieces that are in our drawings here and lay them out on these 4 pieces of wood. These first 2 boards are what's going to be our long stretchers for both the headboard and the footboard. Both of them have pretty good heartwood content. If you just take a peek at the end grain there, you can see that both of them are pretty solid heartwood all the way through. This one does have a few pretty good defects in it. We've got a nice big knot area in here. And then we've got this other knot at the end here. This is only visible on one side, so as soon as we flip the board over, it's completely hidden. So this will make for a nice bottom stretcher on either the headboard or the footboard. So both of these are going to be completely interchangeable. If we have, we'll take the nicer pieces and use them on the footboard, the less nice pieces, put them on the headboard, stuff like that, just to make sure that we have the nicest pieces visible. Then on this piece back here, we've got the vertical legs for the headboard. So we got it all the way up to here. And then again, we've got a little bit of a defect in the wood here, just a bark inclusion that. But luckily, we'll only be using material to about here anyway. So we're going to get some nice, clean grain structure. There is a little bit of sapwood, but again, I'm not too concerned about always trying to hide the sapwood from people seeing it anyway. And then our last board here has the footboard legs at the very bottom, and then we go up to the headboard dividers, and then we've got a big empty space at the top here. We do have this pretty big knocked out area, so obviously it got hit with the forklift or something, so we're just going to have to kind of make do around that. But we're still missing one component from our plans, and that is the dividers for the footboard. So either they can be crammed in this area here, we can make them work around that big crack. So this area is where I would like to put them if I can. So the trick is that from that end cut there up to this line we're going to be cutting is just over 21 inches. For those footboard dividers, we need 21 inches. So we might be able to cram them in there. So that's ideally where we'll get them from. But if not, we will take them from that board. So now that we know where all of our pieces are coming from, we can start probably the most fun part of any woodworking project, and that is the breaking down of the stock and turning it into actual pieces. Because right now we just have a whole bunch of boards. We need pieces out of this to build this bed frame out of. And now I say that this is the most fun part. That's just from my personal opinion, because what you're doing here is you're taking big, massive, oversized pieces and you're refining them. You're going from what is basically a natural piece of wood, other than obviously it's been sawn up, and you're running it through machinery, and you're taking off a lot of material, and you're going from rough stock to nearly finished pieces. So it's just a really fun time because unlike, the end stages of the project where you're standing here, sanding and it's kind of boring, at this stage you get to go and move around the shop. You're using all the different machinery, you're turning things on, you're turning things off. It's a way more fun time to be a woodworker when, you're smashing through woods, you're seeing wood chips fly everywhere, there's dust in the air. That's a much more fun time than hand sanding. So right now we get to enjoy the project at the stage we're at, and it's going to be fun to just kind of start working through these pieces of wood. So now, because our pieces are so big, we get to move the bandsaw over to the other side of the shop. So we have to somehow disconnect it, clear a path and then move it over there so I actually have pasture. So if you ever wondered why commercial woodworking shops have those like absolutely massive dust collectors, this is why. So after milling those, I think, let's see, 12 pieces, so 12 pieces of 8/4 stock, going from 8/4 down to about 1 3/4, we are full to, let's see if I can feel it here. So we're just below this gasket area here. So I filled up into the cyclone, which is never really a good thing to do. That means that some of it did end up outside. But we have this bucket on the bottom filled and then the whole bottom area of the cyclone. Just from those 12 pieces. This was completely empty. I emptied this yesterday, so we were starting with a completely fresh dust collector. So that is pretty dang impressive, I must say. That is a lot of material. So I'm just going to empty this, then we'll go take a look at some of those boards. Okay, so we've got all of our pieces laid on the workbench here and over on the table saw for the longer stretchers. And so you can see that all of these are looking really dang good. Now that we have both faces exposed, they're all looking really, really nice. The only kind of problematic pieces we have currently are these two. Now these two were specifically meant for the footboard section, and I don't know if they're going to end up there because even though right now they are a little bit oversized, our final width is going to be about 4 inches. These are currently over 5 inches, so there is a decent amount of material removed. I don't know if we're going to keep enough heartwood in here to, to make it look good. But that being said, there is also a ton of just beautiful figure in these boards. So I don't know, I'm kind of torn on having a little bit of sapwood showing up in the footboard in exchange for some of this beautiful figure. And then over on our long stretchers, it is a similar story. On our ones that are oversized, you can see that we still have a decent amount of sapwood in there. But for our ones that are closer to size, we've got some really nice stuff. Now, I do have this one kind of giant knot right in kind of an awkward place here. So my plan is we're just going to fill that with some epoxy and kind of hide it in one of the areas and put that one on one of the bottom sides of either the headboard or the footboard. But we also have this one board here that is just spectacularly beautiful. Look at that figure in there. It doesn't really get much better than that. It's kind of a shame to use a piece like that in a project like this. But again, this is just kind of the stuff that I get when I buy it rough sawn, because this beautiful figure that you can get is hidden so well that, the lumber yards that could probably sell this board for a little bit extra don't pull it out of the stack and just kind of throw it in with the general stock. So on our longer stretches, we do kind of have the problem that one side is going to be mainly hardwood, one side is going to be mainly sapwood. And with the boards that I have, there's just no way around it. And again, no matter what you really do with walnut, the longer the pieces of walnut you're going for, the more chances you're going to be sapwood in them. This one is by far probably the worst. You got a big section of sapwood in here. It's going to be really hard to, put this one in an area where it's going to look nice, but we can probably do it. Again, this is the one with the big knot in it that we're going to be filling with some black epoxy. So we'll make sure to stick this one just somewhere where it won't be seen very easily. But we do have a nice edge here that we can show off and make sure that that part is visible anyway. So the final thing here is we have to cut all these boards to width. So right now, like I said, they're all over the place. Some of them are a little bit closer to 4 inches. Some of them are past 5 inches wide. So now we have to get them all down to a nice accurate width. There's 2 ways we can do this. Obviously, we can use the table saw, which is kind of the typical way how you would get this stuff down to its proper thickness. The other way potentially is the thickness planer. So what I've seen in the past is a lot of people do is they take a thickness planer like my DeWalt one here, and you just, because we're dealing with 8/4 stock, it's got a nice wide base to it. You can pass your pieces through. It's stable. It's safe. Theoretically, if anything goes wrong though, everything is going to go wrong. There's a lot of potential for things to go wrong. So what we would do with that method is we would start on the bandsaw, get things down to, everything would be down to the exact same width, but it would be a rough width because with the bandsaw, the blade can move side to side. Then you would pass it through the planer here and everything would come out the other side the exact same width, very precise. Now again, like I said, the only real downside to this is that if something goes wrong, things are going to go wrong really badly. So the other option with the table saw is there's a lot of risk there too, but it's a little bit more of a stable platform. Everything is moving a little bit slower, but again, if things start to go wrong, things can go really wrong. So the big thing is kickback, obviously. With boards this big, the board is probably not going to kick back. What's going to happen is it's going to jam up and damage the blade or damage the table saw if something goes really wrong. So we got to make sure that we make the right choice here, and I'm still kind of pondering what the right choice is. The other thing that I could theoretically do, because I am kind of concerned about both of these options, putting them through the planer or putting them through the table saw, is that I could just rough it out on the bandsaw, get it down very, very close to the width, and then I could just finish it off with a hand plane. That is by far the safest overall option. And so I'm going to start by using the bandsaw to get the stuff to all basically the same rough width. That way, whether I decide to go with the table saw, planer, or hand plane, I'm starting from the exact same point, and it's going to be a lot easier to make sure that things come out fairly consistently and to do it all safely, because then I only have to think about one process and just doing it the same way multiple times. Alright guys, so I have to admit something to you. I've actually been lying. We aren't actually starting a king-size bed frame. This is the beginning of my new business venture. It is called Fanciest 2x4s You Will Ever See, because that is what we currently have a whole bunch of. Right now, this is about a 6-foot 2x4. All the dimensions match, and yeah. So obviously I'm joking, but I'm also not joking. If you want to make this same bed frame out of 2x4s, that's exactly what it's modeled after. Because the trick is this 2x4 dimension is, for one, very appealing to the eye. You have a 2-to-1 ratio for your board thickness, and it just works out really nicely in the shop here. Because I have a 6-inch jointer, this size of board just works out really well. Plus, with all the numbers of how I designed the king size bed frame, everything just worked out nicely to point to this 2x4 size. So the finished dimensions are going to be 1.75 thick by 4 inches wide, all that precisely. So a little bit better than a real 2x4, but yeah, they are. Basically right now I'm holding a Walnut 2x4, which is kind of entertaining. So this is all the milling we're going to do on these for today. I want to let them sit and rest over the next few days here. We've got a whole bunch of other parts we need to put together for this bed frame. We still have the book mesh panels for the headboard and the footboard, and then we also have those side rails, which we need to split those boards in half, do all the milling to them, and then get them back together. So that's going to be a fun process in and of itself. So on these boards right now, I've left a little bit of extra thickness on here so that once I leave these for about 3 or 4 days, the last thing we're going to do though is this knot hole. I want to get it filled, and so that when we come back and we do our final milling process to it, it's all ready to go. Alright guys, so that is going to do it for today. I've got these 2 boards that I did the epoxy fill on, so we got our big knot, and then this other board just has some small cracks in it that I wanted to patch up since we're doing some epoxy work anyway, and I made way too much. I made 150 milliliters of this stuff, and I only used 50 milliliters to fill that big knot hole. I don't know how to use epoxy. This is why I really don't work with epoxy a lot. Plus, that's expensive. So, yeah, definitely, that was a costly mistake there. But I had it sitting around anyway, so it's not that big of a deal. Anyway, I'm going to leave this stuff for a few hours just sitting on the bench here and just kind of spread out around the shop. So tomorrow we're going to start working on those book-matched white oak panels. So it's going to be a really exciting time. We're going to take these already really wide white oak boards, split them in half, and make these beautiful book-matched panels. I'm super excited to do this. But as always, guys, I do hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one. I came with a check on whether or not it was starting to harden up, and I came and found my nice mat all covered in epoxy. So I've learned this lesson doing this exact same thing every single time I've ever touched epoxy, every time I've tried to use it to fill things. You never do a full pour when you're just using tape on the, you never try to do the full fill on the first time. You always do like a light pour or use some much faster setting epoxy. So now it's just dripping out. I've got a piece of paper under here that is for the most part catching all the epoxy anyway. Is what it is. We'll have to deal with this in a few days.